We're going to be learning the sugya that starts to talk about the story of Esther, starting with the Megillah. So we've up to till now, we kind of learned the laws. We tapped in here and there. We just had a few difficult weeks of some difficult subjects. And now we're going to get into the Megillah itself, starting at page 10b. Hold on. Yes, it's 10b, top of the page. It should say Vayehi b'mei Achashverosh. These are the days of Achashverosh, which is how the Megillah begins. Okay, let's bring up the text. Hey, Josh, let's bring up the text here. Okay, for some reason, you have to always double check the English edition to the Steinsaltz, the Ebony Steinsaltz, Ebony Yisrael's Gemara, because for some reason, not always is translation correct or the footnotes in its right place are correct. Okay, so we're, sorry, I have to go back a bit. We're holding on top of page 10b. The top of page 10b, over here. Vayehi b'mei Achashverosh. So that's how everyone knows. That's how the Megillah. Hey Judith, that's how the Megillah begins. The Megillah begins with the opening verse of, and it happened in the days. It came to pass in the days of Achashverosh. Achashverosh, of course, was the king of Persia, and and you have to remember something. The story is we read it in one sitting in 30, 40 minutes, however long it takes. But it was a story of years, even from the Megillah itself. The opening part of the Megillah deals with the feast of Achashverosh in his celebration of his becoming king is many years before the story of Purim and Haman come about. Okay. So Vayehi b'mei Achashverosh, that's how the Megillah starts. Omer Rabbi Levi. Rabbi Levi tells us V'itema Rabbi Yonasan, and some people say this idea is not brought down from Rabbi Levi, but in the name of Rabbi Yonasan. Dover zeh masoiris b'yadeinu. We have a tradition. Mi'anshe Knesset Agdola, from the members of the Great Assembly. Now remember, Mordechai himself was part of the members of the Great Assembly. Kol mokim shenemar Vayehi eni ela lashon sar. Whenever it says Vayehi, whenever a story begins with Vayehi and it came to pass, everyone remembers how Eli Wiesel would start off his speeches and it came to pass, right? So every time it says Vayehi's lashon sar means it's about to tell us a story of grief. Like it says, Vayehi b'mei Achashverosh. It happened days of Achashverosh. What's the grief? Hava Haman. We have the story of Haman. That's obviously a story of grief. Haman wants to kill all the Jewish people. Now there's a lot of reasons why the word Vayehi would be a language of grief. Rabbi Steinsaltz is going to tell us in the word Vayehi is vai is like woe unto me. Also, there's a question of a direction. Vayehi is and it came to pass. It's telling us a story that happened. Yehi would be a story that is going to happen. So Yehi is the present. When you add the vav to Vayehi, is looking as if you want to get away from the present to make it already the past. And that's why it's when do you want to leave an idea? Oh, that's a story I don't want to talk about. That's my past. So when you push something to the past, it's something that's not relevant anymore, hopefully, to the present. So the language of Vayehi, the vav to the Yehi is let it be. I don't want it to be. I want it to be a story. If it happened, it should be my past. I should be past that story. There's a famous story of the Rebbe Rashab's brother. His name was the Razah, the fourth Rebbe of Chabad's son. He had three sons, but two of his sons, one was the Rebbe Rashab, Shamdov Bershnerson, and one was the Razah, Salman Aron. So he was older than the Rebbe Rashab. So he once said he was in a very difficult situation. So they asked him, how did you get out of the situation? He goes, at one point, right, in a few years from now, 5 years, 10 years, it's going to be in the past. So I'm mentally in the past already. I want to be in the past. I want the story to be my past. I don't want it to be my present. Okay, so where's it? So what's the example? Vayehi b'mei Achashverosh, and it happened in the days of Achashverosh, which is the story of Haman. Another example would be the story of how the book of Ruth opens up. Right? The book of Ruth opens up Vayehi b'mei Shvoit HaShoftim, and it was in the days of the judges of Vayehi also, and it came to pass in the days of the judges. And what's the story? What continues? A Havarav. There was a famine, and that's why Elimelech and his wife, they all left. Naomi, they left Beit Lechem for good reasons, bad reasons, but they ran away from the famine. Like Vayehi Heichel Ha'adam L'Roiv, as the people multiplied before the story of Noach. And what happens? Vayar Hashem ki rabba ras Adam. Man wasn't behaving well, and he brought the flood. So we are seeing that there's a pattern. Every time it says in the Torah, right, it came to pass, is about to tell us a story of grief. So the Pnei Yeshua asks a question that, like I said before, the story of Achashverosh is a story that evolved over time, although we read it in one sitting. So why would Vayehi b'mei Achashverosh be a story of grief? The grief comes much later. The grief comes when Haman becomes the viceroy in 7, 8, whatever, how many years it was later. So one of the answers given is that we're going to learn later that Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, when they discuss, what did the Jews do? You know, every once in a while you say, what did the Jews do that God punished them? Why would God decree such a decree? It's not really a conversation that we like to have. You know, what did the Jews do to deserve, God forbid, the Holocaust? These are not conversations we like to have. But the Gemara has that conversation and says, what did the Jews do in the time of Purim that they deserve to have the decree of Haman? And Rab Shimon Bar Yochai says, because they ate from the meal of Achashverosh. So therefore, the grief really starts from the beginning, because the source, the seed for the decree from God, although it took many years for it to come to fruition, started from when the beginning of Megillah, when they sat by the meal of Achashverosh. Another place in the Torah that talks about Vayehi, and it came to pass, that's a story of grief. It says Vayehi b'nasa mikeden, when people went east. And this is the story that they built the Tower of Babylon, which is obviously not a good story. Hava nivnu lanuir, let's build a city. So we see again the word Vayehi, and it came to pass, is about to tell us the story of grief. It says Vayehi b'mei Amraphel. It happened in the days of Amraphel. Amraphel was the king. These kings, the 4 kings and the 5 kings that were this battle that happened in the times of Avram, and Avram had to save his nephew / brother-in-law Lot. So it says Vayehi b'mei Amraphel, and it was in the days of Amraphel, and then there's a Mechama. That's grief. Incidentally, it's brought down in I think Kabbalistic writings possibly, that this or the Talmud, maybe we learned it, that I think maybe we learned it in Sanhedrin, that this war of the 4 and the 5 kings is going to replay itself right before the days of Mashiach. It says we learned in Sanhedrin, this surely we learned in Sanhedrin, that when it says that when Joshua was in Jericho, so what's the grief there? He sees the angel, he was holding a sword. Why was he holding a sword? Like we learned, because it was a punishment to Joshua, that the people, when they weren't fighting at night, God wanted them to study Torah. And they weren't studying Torah. Other opinions, they weren't having relationships, whatever it was. But he was upset at the way Joshua was running things, so to say, during the time of the war. You have a free moment, and one of the most beautiful pictures you have today, when people are fighting the wars of Gaza and Lebanon, is when you see a Daf Yomi Shir happening in Lebanon or Gaza, or you see a picture of someone who's guarding a position with the Talmud open. Yeah, so that's what God wanted. God said to Joshua, "Why are you not studying Torah during the wartime?" So therefore, it was brought grief. There's another came to pass by Joshua before the city, after the city of Jericho falls, and Achan, who takes from the spoils. So that was a bad story. People died, and the soldiers died in the battle of Ai. It says Vayehi ish echad min haramasayim. Also talks about the story of Samuel's mother and father. Who's the man of the place of Ramasayim? Is Elkanah, the father of Samuel the prophet, the one who anoints Saul and King David, who has 2 wives. One of his wives is Chana, and says Chana Ohev Hashem Sagars Rachma. She's a barren woman. Chassidus says she is the barren woman, and we have a barren woman in Torah. So here again is a story of grief, a personal grief, but it's grief. Rashi points out, what's the Charbei Shlufa? What was the sword? Why is it a grief? The sword that the angel held over Joshua. Vitziaroi. This was a unpleasant situation. Shaychichai al bittul Torah. he admonished them why they weren't studying Torah, v'tamid shel ben arbaim, and they missed the korban, they missed the mincha, right? What's the tamid shel ben arbaim? The tamid shel ben arbaim is corresponds to the mincha. My father always tells the story that when my father was, of course, when he was growing up in Brooklyn, so then they had the Brooklyn Dodgers in Ebbets Field. So if you wanted to sneak away from the yeshiva, so you snuck to Ebbets Field. It was probably a quarter to get into the game. So they snuck away from school, him and his buddies, and they played hooky on school. So when they called him in, they made a big deal out of it. They made a big spiel about it. The Rosh Yeshiva and the principal, and they called in. Either they called him my great grandfather, or they were threatening to call my great grandfather, and Reb Shmuel Levitin, which was the dean of the great yeshiva. So they what was their thing? They said, you missed mincha, because when they went to the game, they were at the game. They missed the mincha davening. So also they were fighting in Jericho, and what's the angel say? You missed mincha. You missed the tamid shel ben arbaim, the tamid in the afternoon. So there's another Vayehi. There's another story of the grief. It says Vayehi Kizak and Shmuel, and it came to pass when Samuel. We see we're going in order as time goes on. So it came to pass when Samuel was older. The grief was his children didn't behave properly. They were taking bribes. It says about David, and it came to pass that David was successful in all ways. God was with him, right? We know that we learned in Sanhedrin that one of the things that Achitophel and Doeg had against David was that God was always with him. What does it mean God was with him? In the Beis Medrash, in the yeshiva, the law was always according to David. They would everyone likes to argue in the shul, right? In the yeshiva. This is what the rabbi means. This is the law, that's the law. David was always right. And that bothered people. Like it bothers people till today. What happens? Vayehi shal oyenes David. So Saul starts to be suspicious of David, and that leads to the battle between Saul and David. So it didn't lead to good things. So again, we see the language of it came to pass, and it ends up being a story of grief. It says, Vayehi ki yoshev hamelech beisai. The king was sitting in his house. David, again, we're progressing with time. David is sitting in the house of the king. Rak ata lo yisivna bais. He was sitting in the house of the king, and he had a dream, so to say, a vision that he would love to build a temple. And God says, no, you can't build a temple. That was a personal grief for David. He couldn't build a temple, although he prepared it, him and Samuel, and the blueprints, and he did the things that he could do. We just read in the Eicha, it says, that the gates sunk into the ground. Why did the gates sink into the ground? Because David made the gates. If David makes the gates, everything David makes is like Moshe makes. The gates last for everything. Ma'aseh David is La'olam. David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayim. David is a person, one of the people that live, everything about him lives forever. So if he built the gates don't get destroyed, they sink into the ground. He wanted to build a temple. Had David built a temple, it would be a different temple. But God says, that's grief. So the grief is not just a personal grief, it's also essentially a universal grief, because it led to the possibility for the destruction of the temple. So Rashi says, what happened? See, this is, there's a Gemara that says, in the Halacha, it talks about when does a person have to make a blessing for the grief, and when does a person make a blessing for good news, right? So you could have sometimes that good news is wrapped in bad news, and bad news is wrapped in good news. For instance, the Gemara gives an example. Unfortunately, as unfortunate as it is, it's a situation. If someone passes away, so the child is in grief, it's passing, but with the grief comes inheritance. So what do you make? Do you make a blessing for Baruch Atov Meitiv? Are you thankful for your inheritance, or are you grieving your father's or your mother's passing? You say Baruch Dain Ha'emes. So we have certain things that seem to be sometimes good news can be wrapped in bad news. David HaMelech had Hatzlacha. Vayehi, that seems to be good news, but with it came bad news. What was the grief? The grief was Saul was jealous. Vachsiv, now the Gemara challenges this idea. So what does Reb Levi teach us? Reb Levi teaches us, or Reb Yonasan, that any time the Torah tells us throughout the Tanakh, and he quoted various verses, that whenever the Torah starts off a story and it came to pass, Vayehi, it's coming to tell us a story of grief. I mean, he brings many stories to support that. But now the Gemara challenges that statement. The Gemara says, V'chsiv, but we find other times it says Vayehi and it came to pass. And it's not a story of grief. For instance, Vayehi b'yom hashmini, on the 8th day of dedication of the tabernacle by Moshe. That's the day. V'tanya oisa yom hoisa simcha l'fnei Kadosh Baruch Hu, ki yom shnivra b'y shemayim v'aretz. So how can you say it's a day of grief? It says the day that they dedicated the tabernacle is a day of joy for God, like the day the earth was created. It means from the date of creation till the date they put up the temple and the tabernacle. And you have to remember there was a lot in between, right? There was the Egypt, there was the flood, there was right before that the golden calf. God was right back to where he started from, as excited as he was with the creation of the world. So how could you say it's a day of grief? So he answers, how do we know that this was a day of joy for God, like the creation of the heaven and earth? Because we have a Gzeir Shavu. We could put the two verses together. It says Vayehi b'yom hashmini, because it says it came to pass on the 8th day, and the beginning creation says Vayehi boker yom echad, that it came to pass that the first day of creation. So Vayehi talking about a date, the 8th day, the first day. So to say from the 7th day. Also, if you actually think about it, and the Chassidus talks about this many times, that really the 7 days of creation is the 7 days of the limitations of the world of the cycle of 7. The 8th day is a continuation of that day. It's the 8th day of the 7 days of creation. So it's really very much connected to creation of the world. Every limitation that we have in the first day of creation, we grow out of that on the 8th day. So that's a continuation of the joy of it brings substance to the first 7 days. That this is the purpose of creation, is to have v'shachanti b'sochem, that God should basti l'gani. God came back to his garden like he came like he was there in the day of creation. So the Gemara says yes, it was. Again, this is how do you look at good news and bad news? It's a very good day. God was very excited. It's the 8th day, and the day of the dedication of the tabernacle gave purpose to the date of creation. But Hashchiv Nadav and Avihu, but there still was some bad news because Nadav and Avihu passed away, so there was grief in that day. And the 2 sons of Aaron passed away, so there was grief. Again, the Gemara says, when the Gemara talks about the laws of what blessing do you make on a passing, the Gemara, the halacha has an interesting law. If you inherit with your siblings, so it's not such, everyone knows, unfortunately, right or wrong, but the fact is that sometimes even if the will is super clear, there's sometimes it doesn't go unchallenged without some issues or disagreements. So therefore, if you have siblings, it's not such good news, even though you're getting a Yerusha, you're getting an inheritance. But if you're an only child and you have no one to argue with, and you get the entire inheritance, it's really a tova meitiv. I mean, as much as the person saying Baruch Ta'ina Emes, but there's a lot of tova meitiv. And the Gemara, the halach asks the question, which blessing do you make? A blessing for the good, for the inheritance, or a blessing for the sadness of the grief of the passing? So now the Gemara says, okay, so we can't use the verse that says, and it came to pass on the day of the 8th day of dedication of the tabernacle. But we have another day that we could say positive. So it came about on the 80th year, in the 400th year, meaning i.e. 480 years. And that's the date that the temple was created. So that was definitely a good day. The temple was created that day. Also, they have that when Yaakov saw Rachel, that's also a good day, right? And the first day of creation, nothing was wrong on that day. Nothing bad happened on the first day of creation. We have the second day of creation. We have many times that we have the expression "it came to pass" that's not negative. So why are we saying that every time it says "it came to pass" is negative? As Rashi mentioned the idea of Rachel, because Rachel also, there's a bit of a challenge. Rachel has the story with that it says that Yaakov cried. Vayehi kasher roa Yaakov es Rachel, it says he cried. And some people say, Rashi quotes right away, why does he cry? He cries either because she won't have children, but mainly Rashi quotes she won't be buried with him. Rachel's buried in cave of Rachel, right? It says, so maybe there's not such a good news about the story of this, there is grief with Rachel. It says Vayises koile vayev. So he says, the Rashash asked that question. So the Maharsha says, and this is the proof that because the grief happened much later, only after 20 or so years after Rachel passes away. So therefore, it's not a grief that's not a grief. The grief has to be very right next to the statement it came to pass. Therefore, we have to say, like we answered before, that even though the story of Haman happens many years after the beginning of the Megillah, but the seeds were planted when the Jewish people took joy in the invitation, right? They liked the fact that the Jews were invited to the great meal. They felt special. They felt like, they felt they belonged. As we're going to learn, that's a very difficult concept about how the Jews are supposed to feel in Galus. But Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, the great Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, who looks at everything as Ga'on Yaakov, the strength of the Jewish people. Reb Shimon Bar Yochai was a very straight, even in how he approached Rome, he wouldn't give in that Rome is good. So Reb Shimon Bar Yochai says, well, they shouldn't have taken joy in being invited at the meal. A Jew doesn't take pride about being invited at a Gentile's meal like that. So he says, Omer Rabashi. Rabashi answers. So we have a question though. We have plenty of verses, especially the days of creation, where it says it came to pass, and it's not a negative story. So Omer Rabashi answers us, and he says like this, that no, we have to put a little star to that statement. Kol Vayehi ikahachi v'ikahachi. Every Vayehi has some good times, some good times. So it came to pass is either a good story or a bad story. Others say that it means to say it's an extremely good story. When the Torah starts off and it came to pass, it's not just telling us and it came to pass and we had dinner. We came to pass, something is about to happen, good or bad. So we came to pass, Vayehi bimei, but when it says it happened in the days, came to pass in the days, Eni al lashon sar, then it's only grief. So when he put a kind of a footnote on there, he says that Vayehi means something extreme is about to happen. If it says that it came to pass in the days, that's always only going to talk about a story of grief. Okay, so let's see what Rebbe Steinzat says over here. This finishes this. No, we have another line. So I say Vayehi b'mei. The Gemara explains the basis for associating the term Vayehi and it came to pass with grief by viewing the word as Vai and he. Vai is like whoa. So that's an expression of it's like an ancient expression of grief, meaning woe and mourning. This explanation is also found in the Medrash, which elucidates the term Vayehi as used to express extremes. So, like we said before, it's an extreme situation. In instance of joy and happiness, it expresses extreme happiness. While in cases of trouble and grief, it refers to overwhelming calamity. So, like I said, Vayehi is about to tell us a story of something great to happen, either good, extreme, either good, temples up, or grief, Haman's around. There are those who understand Rav Ashi's statement in the Gemara in this manner. Others explain that when it is written and it came to pass, it is possible that the phrase is not indicative of a constant misfortune. However, when it is written and it came to pass in the days, the verse is referring to extended period of time, and expression is always indicative of grief. Okay, so basically that when you add it came to pass in the days is kind of an extended period of time, and usually that extended period of time goes with grief. Okay, now he says v'chamisha vayehi bimei, and there's 5 times it says it came to pass in the days. Meaning to say, kind of the Gemara is a little bit walking back a lot of the examples that we brought, because now we're quoting 5, and these 5 are not the same 5 we mentioned before. Why does it mention different ones? Is a good question. So it says vayehi bimei hayu. There's 5 vayehi bimei hayus. There's 5 statements of Vayehi that are connected to grief because it came to pass in the days, which is our story. Vayehi b'Achashverosh came to pass in the days of Achashverosh. Of course, that's the story of grief, the story of Haman. Vayehi b'mei Shfait HaShoftim. Okay, we do quote this one, which is the beginning of the story of Ruth, which ends up being a story of a famine. Vayehi b'mei Amraphel, also the story of the battle of Avram. So we quoted these 3. Now we quoted another 2 that we didn't. Vayehi b'mei Achaz, Vayehi b'mei Yaakov. These are 2 bad kings of David. Yoakim was, of course, the horrible king, one of the last kings before the destruction of the temple. He was the one who tortured and wanted to kill Yirmiyahu. So these are obviously the days of Achaz and the days of Yoakim are not days of, these are bad days. Why do we quote these initially is another question. So he says, and we don't tell, the Gemara doesn't tell us what happened in those days, like it told us in other ones, but you don't have to. If you open up the Navi, you'll see clearly what happened in those days. The Gemara does not state explicitly what happened, what form of suffering befell the people during these periods. It could be that also the change of the language of the Gemara, that when it says the words Vayehi b'yimei, and it came to pass in the days, when it says Vayehi alone, it came to pass, that could be a private grief. Although these are universal personalities, that anything that happens to them affects, like David, even if it's a personal grief, David's the king, so it affects everyone. But the actual, it's really just about David and Saul, right? But when you add Vayehi b'yimei came into the days, then it's not talking so much about the individual, it's talking about the time period. And the time period is always about the people. So he says that's what the Gemara, so therefore we quote different examples. He says the Gemara does not explicitly, the Gemara does not state explicitly what form of suffering befell the people during these periods, meaning at least Achaz and Yahakum. The Marsha explains that it is unnecessary to do so, as the passages of the Bible following these verses detail the suffering. You don't have to guess. Open up the Navi, and you'll see what happened in the days of Achaz and the days of Yaakov that occurred in the Jews, including being besieged and defeated in battle. These are not good days. Okay. Now he says this. Some understand that the explanation of Rav's, I'm trying to figure, I think this footnote was mistranslated from the Hebrew version, because I'm not sure which Rav he means. Maybe he means Rav Levi. Served as his introduction to the Megillah, connecting it with the verse in Devarim that he cites, which is the bad things that happen. These verses which say, and there shall be, and there you shall sell yourselves and your enemies for bondsmen and bondswomen, and no one shall buy you. So it's talking about days that happened in the Gullus. Also the story of Megillah. But if we had been, Esther says, but if we had been sold as bondsmen and bondswomen, I would have had my peace. I mean, she said, if we would have been sold, it's okay. I mean, I would have handled it. But now they want to kill us. The Jews at the time, of the time would gladly have sold themselves as slaves to escape death, but there was no buyer, says the Marsha. Okay, so I'm not sure what this footnote is connected to, but basically, the reason why we say the opening of Vayehi b'yimei is the opening to the story. Omer Rabbi Levi. Okay, now that Rabbi Levi, this finishes the opening piece of the Gemara, that we're going to get back to the story of the Megillah, but before that, we're going to jump to a few other subjects. Rabbi Levi says, we have a tradition from our forefathers. This doesn't say that our forefathers are the members of the Great Assembly, so it doesn't say who the forefathers are. Before we said, with regard to Vayehi b'yimei being days of grief, or a statement of grief, that's from the Anshe Knesset of Gdola, the members of the Great Assembly, who were the heads of the Jewish people during the story of Esther. So now we have another tradition from our forefathers, meaning from the prophets, possibly also from the members of the Great Assembly, that Amoz and Amaziah Achim, that Amoz and Amaziah were brothers. Who's Amoz and Amaziah? So last week, everyone, we read the Haftorah of Shabbos Chazon. Shabbos Chazon starts off, I'll bring it up if my computer doesn't jump and gives me straight to where we're trying to go. Starts with the first chapter of Isaiah. How does Isaiah start off? Chazon Yeshaya ben Amoz. So Amoz is the father of Isaiah. When does he say prophecy? When is he a prophet, Isaiah? So the pasuk continues, Asher Chazal Yerushalayim, that he said prophecy about Yehuda, and Jerusalem, in the days of Uziyahu, Yasam, Achaz we just mentioned, and Yechizkiyahu, and he's killed by his grandson, Chizkiyahu, son of Menashe. So he's a prophet during 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5 kings, because Menashe kills him after Chizkiyahu dies. So he's a prophet, but who's the king before Uziyahu? Amaziah. So Amoz and Amaziah are brothers, meaning Isaiah was from the house of the king. He was a descendant of David. He was the king Uziyahu's nephew and uncle. First cousin, and then related to Yasim, Achaz, and Chizkiyahu. So he was related to the kings. When he prophesies to Chizkiyahu in the story of Sancheriv, and later with Menashe, he's already a grandfather by then of his, because his daughter marries Chizkiyahu. So he's family. He's part of the house of the king, which wasn't uncommon that the prophets should be part of the family. So he says we have a Mesorah, we have a tradition that Amoz, the father of Isaiah, and Amaziah, the father of Uziyahu, they were brothers. One son, my son is in business and my son is a prophet. You say everyone's taking pride. So Amoz taking pride in his son who's a prophet, and Amaziah says, my son is the king. So Amaziah Achim Mashman, who cares? I mean, why is that important information to know that Amoz and Amaziah were brothers? What's the significance of that? So Rashi says, Amoz and Amaziah, who's Amoz? Aviv Shel Yeshaya. He's the father of Isaiah. Amaziah Melech Yehuda, and of course Amaziah is the king before Uziyahu. So the reason is it's coming to tell us something. Kihad Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani. This is a story. This is an idea that's taught by Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Nachmani, which the Rebbe always quotes. Nachmani is from the word Nachama. So Amar Rabbi Yonasan, he says in the name of Rabbi Yonasan, Kol Kala Shitznu Beis Chameha, a bride who's modest in her father-in-law's home. Right? You have some brides who come to the father-in-law, the parents-in-law, the mother-in-law, and the father-in-law don't like her dress and whatever, don't like the way she behaves herself. But if it's not like that, so she says, Judith, yes, Menashe is the son of Chizkiyahu, and also the grandson of Yeshaya, because Yeshaya marries his daughter off to his cousin's kid, to Chizkiyahu. So Chizkiyahu and Yeshaya make a marriage. Yeshayahu becomes the father-in-law of Chizkiyahu, obviously the grandfather Menashe, and then he kills him. Okay, so it says, it's an unfortunate story. That's Menashe. Menashe was an unfortunate king. So it says, so Rabbi Yonah says, Kol Kala, every bride, she'tznua bebeis chameha, that is modest in her father-in-law's home. The Torah says something. You want to have great descendants? Be modest in your father-in-law's home. What's the proof? Tamar. We learned this from Tamar. Tamar is, of course, the daughter-in-law of Yehuda. She marries Yehuda's first two sons, doesn't have children with them because if they die, as the Torah tells us, the sins of Aaron Onan. Later, she has children with her father-in-law. It's another story. But either way, from her we learn that if you're modest in your father-in-law's home, you will have kings and prophets. Dichsiv, as it says, how do we know this? It says, Vayireha Yehuda, when Yehuda sees Tamar, she dresses and she gets on the road to, so to say, seduce Yehuda, her father-in-law. It says, he thinks she's a prostitute. He kisses up on her because she covered her face. The Torah says, seemingly the Torah is trying to say, how did Yehuda not know that he's looking at his daughter-in-law? Because it says, because she covered her face. So seemingly she was covering her face. He didn't recognize who she was. He wasn't looking too detailed in her face. And therefore he didn't recognize that this is his daughter-in-law, Tamar. Just because she covered her face, automatically he thinks she's a prostitute. I mean, what's the deal? So we'll get back to Rabbi Steinsaltz in a second. So Ella Mishum the kisses apanea beis chameha. Not that she covered her face now. He never saw her properly when she was his daughter-in-law. When she was in her father-in-law's home, she didn't walk around. She had a covering on her face. He never really saw her properly when she lived in his home. Therefore, he never really recognized her. So when he sees her on the street, now she looks like a prostitute. He never thinks that this is maybe Tamar. Therefore, because she was modest in her father-in-law's home, she merited to have kings and prophets as her descendants. Why? Melachim David, because of course kings come from Tamar. Tamar is the grandmother of King David, right? From Zerach and from Peretz, sorry. So David comes from Tamar, and that's whose prophets? Prophets again, plural. So the prophets are that Amoz is a brother to Amaziah. Amaziah is from the house of David, that's a king, but Amoz is himself as a prophet. Because the rule is, anytime you say a prophet, the son of so, right? The Yeshaya opens up, these are the prophecies of Isaiah, the son of Amoz, means to say that Amoz was also a prophet. So it's plural. Nevi'im is Amoz and Amoz, and Yeshaya are the two prophets from the house of David. And why did Tamar merit to have descendants that were great prophets? Because she was modest in her father-in-law's home. V'chsiv chazon Yeshaya ben Amoz. And Yeshaya, the son of Amoz, both of them were prophets. Okay, we're going to go back to the Rebbe Steinsaltz in a second. Some write, there's a lot of questions about the statement. One of the story, the whole story is questionable, obviously. The story of Tamar and Yehuda is in general not an easy story. But another story is also, why couldn't you just say David and Solomon were prophets? David and Solomon were also prophets, right? David speaks to God all the time, and Solomon speaks to God. So the answer is that they had prophecy, but they weren't prophets. Meaning to say that if you want to, no one says David the prophet. They David the king, David HaMelech, Shlomo HaMelech. Their prime job was they were known for being kings. Prophecy was as great as it was that they had. It was not their main identity. Whereas Yeshaya was identified as a prophet, so was his father Amoz. Okay, some write that this statement concerning the rewards of a woman who is modest is mentioned in this tractate connected to Rabbi Levi's tradition with the subject of the Megillah. Why? Because the Gemara relates Esther's modesty and states the various miracles were performed. So in her merit as a result. So the Re'ei Dudiem says, why do we talk about this story of Tamar in the book of Esther? Because Esther also was modest. The Gemara tells us about how she behaved in general with modesty. She didn't dress herself up for Achashverosh. That was acts of modesty, and also while she was queen, she was modest. So Rashi says that he says that, hold on a second. The Melamed Shekisa Paneh Beis Chameha, that she covered her face in her father-in-law's home. Lefikach lehi kira. Achshav shaf veisoi leira paneh sheyehei makira. Rashi says he never properly saw her face in his home, that he recognized her. It's also a sign about Yehuda. He didn't look at his daughter-in-law, but but she was covered. Her face was covered. It was her modesty, and therefore we see that was the modesty. The Ein Yaakov explains that according to tradition, whenever a prophet's name is stated while mentioning his father's name as well, Yeshaya ben Amoz, because that's only one. Isaiah is one prophet. The text is indicating that his father was also a prophet, maybe not as great as Yeshaya, but Amoz was also a prophet. The Marsha adds that although King David and his son King Solomon were prophets, like I asked, right? So if you want to find prophets, descendants of Tamar, there's others. There's Solomon and David were straight up prophets. The Gemara did not mention them as proof that one who is modest will merit descendants who are prophets. This is because they were distinguished primarily as monarchs and not prophets, right? They were known as kings, not as prophets. The Gemara is seeking proof of this principle from individuals who were only prophets, and therefore mentioned Isaiah and Amoz's father. Okay, that's a simple answer. Okay, now we have a very famous Gemara that's mentioned many times, the idea of the ark not taking up any space. And how is it? Just before we get to that, there's something that has to be studied a bit more. We're coming out of the Churban now, so it's maybe important to just mention this. When Shlomo Melech built the temple, see if again this picture comes up. When Shlomo Melech built the temple, so we all know about the angel-like figures on top of the ark. That's like right here in this picture here. If you see to the left, there's a picture of the ark. So it says it had the staff of Aaron was next to the ark. We had the jar of man, and we had the jar of anointing oil. So that all was in the Holy. This is the Holy of Holies. Nothing's allowed to be in the Holy of Holies, right? So the ark itself, on top of the ark, on the kapores, is what we know is the kruvim, the childlike, the angel-like figures. But aside from that, there is these two big kruvim. You see here in the right picture, that take up all the kind of the space of the Holy of Holies. That's where we look. Now this space over here of the Holy of Holies should be 20 by 20 amos by 30. Eventually you're going to see it's 30 amos high. So we have these kruvim over here, the big ones, that take up the wall space. But the problem is that, as others are going to ask, it only takes up the wall space on top, not on the bottom. Right, because the ark is in between them. So if you look at this picture, there's nothing odd about this picture to indicate any miracle. You're going to have the ark, and you're going to have the kruvim. These are separate kruvim that Shlomo made. Again, it's a subject on its own of what that all meant. But those were in the Holy of Holies. So let's see if you could get this picture up here. No, that's lucky. No, let's see if I could get back to the Talmud. Here we go. So here, just a picture of the way it looked from a bird's eye view of the inside of the sanctuary. Here we go. So this is the tabernacle. So of course this little place over here where the menorah and the table is. That's called the oil moed. but inside here is the Holy of Holies. So the temple didn't look exactly, it wasn't a replica, but we have this idea is that you have these big kruvim that are standing that Shlomo built. So here now the Gemara says like this. Amar Reb Levi says, and Reb Levi says, we have another tradition from our forefathers. And what is that? Which is a huge miracle. The ark didn't take up space in the tabernacle. What does it mean it didn't take up space? So let's see what Rashi says. Eina min amida. Eini oiches lemait midas akarka lechol tzadov klum. The ark did not take up any ground space in the Holy of Holies at all. Klum means at all. Kidiktani. How do we know? As we learned, yesh lo esher amas lechol ruach beemtza beis kodesh hakadashim. Hayoshev v'yesh revach beinay lebein aksalim esher amas lechol tzad v'chol bayis in yelachov al chof. Why? The whole temple, Holy of Holies, was 20 on 20, and it had. But if you measured from the ark, from the right side of the ark, back to the picture, if you measured from, let's say, from here to the wall, you would have 10 amas. If you measured from the other side to the wall, you had 10 amas. But the whole room was only 20 amas. So where was the ark? That means if you measured from the one side of the ark to the wall, you had 10 arm lengths. If you measured from the other side of the ark, you had 10 arm lengths. But if you measured from the wall to the wall, you also had only 20. So meaning to say that the ark didn't take up space, which is a miracle. It was there. If you measured the ark itself had a measurement of space. And that's that's the idea of Kol Yochel, of Nimna Mim Nois, the counting and the not counting. This is one of the great, this idea of something that is spacious, but takes up no space in this world is a miracle. It's not possible. And that's to show that God is that space is as a creation by God. And where does God show that? In the Holy of Holies is the holy place of the world. That the ark doesn't take up any space. So like he says, you measured. So if you check from each side of the ark, you had 10 arm lengths. And if you check the whole room, it's only 20 arm lengths. Meaning to say, although it itself measures space, it doesn't take up space. Why? Because space is a creation. And that's one of the miracles of the Holy of Holies. Tani Namihach, we also learned. Aron Moshe, the ark that Moshe made, meaning that it's made in Moshe's times. There's 10 arm lengths on each side. And then it says, that the dvir, which is the space that separates between the Holy of Holies and the Holy, or the sanctuary and the inner sanctuary, is 20 arm lengths. And it says, Knaf hakruv ha'echad esr amas, u'knaf hakruv ha'echad esr amas, Aron gufa hechei. So this statement of the Gemara doesn't prove really anything. That's a lot of the commentaries ask. Because what does he say here? The idea that you measure from the wall of from the ends of the ark and you get 10 arm lengths and 10 arm lengths on the other side and 20 altogether, obviously shows that there's no ark. But here he says that the space was 20 arm lengths, and the wings of the big kruvim were each one 10 arm lengths. So where was the ark? It had to sit in between. But if you look at the picture, you wouldn't have that question, because you could say, okay, these wings could touch the wall and touch each other, and each one is 10 and make up 20, but still the ark is underneath the wings. The expansion of the wings doesn't mean that the wings together are 20, it means that the ark didn't take up space, because in this picture, the ark is sitting under the wings. So it's not exact. That's what some of the commentaries asked that question. So what's the sign? It was a miracle. He says, "Lifnei hadvir cholol beis kodesh hakadashim shehu lifnim hadvir." The inner space of the sanctuary, of the inner sanctuary, which is in the inner side of the dvir. The dvir is the division between the holy and the Holy of Holies. The dvir, which separates between the Holy and the Holy of Holies, is all made up of 20. And if it's made up of 20, and the ark took up space of 3, I believe, 3.5, whatever it was. So then it takes up. The question is, where did the ark stand? It was miraculous. He says the wings of one of the krubos was 10 cubits. But again, the wings sat over the ark. So a lot of commentaries ask that question. I just want to see some of the answers. The Turi Zov the Turi Evans, asks that question. It says the Gira Meshuvevasi, the Kanfe Akruvim Lekerai, the Oimid Benes, the Oren Benes Oimid, the Ha Kanfe Akruvim Goivim, how you harb me Oren. The wings were much higher than the ark, so the wings could expand each 10 amos, but the ark stood under the wings. It doesn't give the answer to that question. It's a good question. There's other questions, but the basis is that the main point is that, like Rashi says, is that if you measure from the ark itself, it didn't take up space. This is the Gemara quotes this pasuk of the Kruvim. So the expansion of the Kruvim were tall. So again, it's not the question is what's the proof of this Tani Namahachi? Okay. Now the Gemara goes back to the Megillah. Rabbi Yonasan pasach la pischa lahai parasha asamihacha. That we have a tradition that if you go into certain teachings, Avagadic teachings, we don't start off just with a story. We start off with a verse to lead us to the story, to tell us where does the story come from? What's the story connected to? So we find that many times also, like if you open up a Rabbeinu Bechaya, who is a commentary in the Chumash, Rabbeinu Bechaya will open a verse when he starts talking about on the parsha. He'll quote a verse from Shir HaShirim. Or if you open up any Maimer Chassidus, it starts with a verse. So there's kind of like an opening verse that leads into a teaching. Same thing that already started in the Talmud times. That when going into a story like the story of Esther, we want to quote a verse that's going to take us to that space. So when Rabbi Yonasan was Pischa, he started off the high parshas, the story of Mihachi. It says like this. He quotes a verse from Isaiah that says, "V'kamti aleihem, for I will rise up against." Now, you have to remember two things. In the story of Esther and Mordechai, there's two parts of the story. There's the initial seemingly success of the Jews' enemies, which it really included Achashverosh himself. He was no good friend of the Jews, but surely included Haman, and the fall of these people. I mean, Achashverosh didn't get punished, but he became a friend of Mordechai and Esther, and Haman is hung with his family on the gallows. So how does this whole story come about? So he quotes a verse from Isaiah: "V'kamti aleim, I will rise up against them, says the Lord of hosts. V'hichrati," from the word kares, lebavel, shame. I will cut from Babylonia name, usha'ar, and remnant. V'nin, nin is like a great grandchild, v'nechel, and a grandchild. So says the Lord, Num Hashem. What does it mean? So God is quoting the punishments that are going to befall the enemies of the Jewish people. Shame zaksav. The Babylonian writing no longer exists. So says the Gemara. Shar zeloshen. The Babylonian language doesn't exist. There will be some who ask questions on this. We'll get to that in a second. Well, maybe it means the aristocratic language, because it could be Aramaic was the language. Nin is not referring to only a grandson. Nin is like it says about Shlomo Melech, that it calls the verse he quotes in a second, Inun, Shemo, right? So that's Malchus, that's royalty. V'neched, and the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, is Vashti. We all know that Vashti is a granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. That didn't help in her Shalom Bayis at all. Achashverosh was very insecure about that. She was always reminding him that she came from aristocrat, from royalty, and he was a Tzugakumener. He married up, and that's why he was fast to punish her. These were deeper issues than just the story tells. But that's a revenge that God is taking on Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, for destroying the temple and exiling the Jews. So Rashi says, whenever Rabbi Yonasan wanted to start telling us the story, the Agada of Purim, first he talked about the story of what led to this. Nothing happens by chance. Everything is pre-designed. This is talking about why did Bavel, what happened really, literally, right? In the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, was taken over by Koresh, by the Persians. The Persians invaded the Babylonians, and Achashverosh was a king of Persia. He married Vashti, which was the queen, the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. That wasn't uncommon to marry your enemies, or to secure the kingdom. We have that in Jordan. But v'kamti aleim b'pranis b'avachsiv. That's talking about Bavel. Ze'aksav ein lo ksav elam u'umas acheres. No longer does Babylonia have its own language. Its writing, its alphabet is from other languages. Nin loshin memshala ki yinun shmo. He quotes from Tillim about Shlomo Melech. Yinun shmo Nin is a language of royalty, that they lost royalty. There's no longer royalty in the house of Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar. Yimshal v'yigdal. Okay. So Tosfos asks the question: She'ein sha'ar ze lashon kasha shadayin heim misaprim bebavel b'lashon Aramis. They're still talking and counting in Aramaic, which is a Babylonian language. So why did he say they lost their language? Right? They lost their language. Never mind their alphabet. There was two levels of language. There was the common language and the royal language, the house of the king. There was a kind of a private royal language that the house of Nebuchadnezzar had. That language was lost. The common language is what's there. Okay, he says like this. I think there's a few commentaries I want to bring down. One, he says the Tosfos read says something interesting. That we see the mamish till today. Right? Everyone wants to know English, right? Educate your children in English. People want to find out what's the next language, what's the best language to teach my children so they could get ahead. Should I teach them Mandarin because China's growth? What's the language? Everyone wants to learn English. How good is their English? In Israel, when they want to vote a prime minister, does he have good English? Why? Because that it shows the dominance of a country, of a superpower, when everyone wants to know that language. Bibi doesn't have to know Russian. He doesn't have to know Mandarin, but he has to know English. So that was also in those days. So when no longer when people stop wanting to know English, that's a sign of decline. And the decline in the times of Bavel, the Tosfos read says, no one was interested to know Aramaic anymore. They didn't need to converse in the Babylonian language, because who cared? Babylonia was a has-been. And therefore, that was a sign of a lack of dominance. When other countries want to know your language, it shows that you're a country of importance. So Rashi says so Reb Stein says like this: it was common practice for the sages of the time. Like I said, we have that Rabbeinu Bachai starts with the pasuk to begin teaching the book of the Bible with an agadic, with a verse from another book, like a book over here we're quoting from Isaiah. The idea is that it imparts lessons pertained of the book of the Bible that the sages is ultimately teaching. So the idea is trying to teach of how we came to the story of Esther. These types of introductions are an integral part of the Agadic Medrash. The Pnei Yeshua explains that although the Talmud really includes these forms of Agadic teachings, the numerous introductions here, I'm going to mention a whole bunch, not just one, are mentioned in order to support the decision to include the scroll of Esther in the Bible. Because remember, we learned before that we weren't sure, the rabbis weren't sure if they wanted to include Esther in the Bible. So therefore, by showing how people taught these verses, and these verses are kind of leading to the story of Esther, shows that the story of Esther is a story of importance. By presenting various examples of the other books of the Bible alluding to the scroll of Esther, others explain that helps to support that the book of Esther should be included in the Tanakh. Others explain that these introductions are intended to prove that the entire Megillah is significant, not only the central parts recounting the actual miracles. So that's why we don't start from Vayehi achar dvar me'ela. Really, we should start from maybe the second chapter, when Haman comes into power. So the reason we don't talk, so we stay from the beginning, is to show that the whole story, how did Achashverosh become king? Who's Vashti? Right? So this is all part of a verse of Isaiah. The Gemara cites a dispute concerning which sections of the Megillah must be read. These introductions are intended to prove that not only the story of the miracle should be read, but even the first part should be read as well. It appears to be an introduction as well. It appears to be an introduction, but it is also has independent importance as it reveals other miracles that the Holy One, blessed be He, performed. In other words, how He fulfilled the prophecy to destroy Babylonia and all associated with it. Okay, let's just do one more. He says like this. Omer Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani. Rabbi Shmuel Nachmani says, Psachli Pischalai Parsha Me'ocha. He quoted another verse. And what was the verse that he quoted to start teaching the Megillah? Tachas ha'na'atzutz yala berosh, v'tachas ha'sirpad yala hadas. That the na'atzutz is the thorn. So he says that instead of the thorn shell, the evergreen, the brosh is like an evergreen tree. And tachas ha'sirpad, the sirpad is a kind of, what do they call it here? He calls it a nettle, which is a kind of insignificant plant. Will yala hadas, which is the myrtle, which is the hadas, which is referring to Esther. Tachas and atzutz, what's the thorn? Tachas Haman Rasha, Sha'asa Atzme Avodah Zarah. He made himself an Avodah Zarah, and therefore that's why Hanatzutz, B'chol Hanitzutzim, B'chol Hana'alolim. We have a verse in Isaiah that talks about thorns and shrines. That's a reference to Avodah Zarah, and Haman made himself a Avodah Zarah, so he's a Natzutz. He's like a thorn who comes up Mordechai. So he says, the Marsha explains that the nature of the Gemara's proof, as there seems to be no indication in the verse that this is discussing idolatry. It's just saying that Haman's a thorn. But he leaves his query unanswered. Perhaps the Gemara's understanding relies on the understanding of the Targum Yonasan. He explains thorns of shrines, of barmos. So that means the house of idol worship. So that's the idea of the Na'atzutz. Yala Barosh is Mordechai. Shenikra Rosh L'chol Absamim. He's like the head of all good spices. Shneimar V'ata Kach Psamim Rosh. When we talk about the psamim, the spices for the ketores, it says Rosh Mordoror. One of the sources of Mordechai min Torah minayin. Where do we see Mordechai in the Torah? Esther min Torah minayin is Anochi Haster Aster. Mordechai min Torah minayin is from Mordoror, which is close to Mordechai. And Mordoror is kind of the spices of Metargmin Moridachi, which is like Mordechai, right? Take out the yud, it's Mordechai. Tachas Asirpad, Tachas Vashti Harasha'a, Bas Benoishal Nebuchadnezzar Harasha. Aside, who pushes Vashti aside? The granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, the evil. Shesara Frifidas Beis Hashem, that she burnt the ceilings of God. The Chsiv Rifidas Eizav, it's covered with gold. Yala Hadas comes Esther. Zu Esther Atzadekes, Esther the righteous. Shnei Krois Hadassah, like it says, Vayehi Oymen Hadassah, that she was raised. He brought her up Hadassah, which is referring to Esther. Vayehi Lashem Lashem Zu Mikra Megillah La'ois Olam La'ikaris Eli Meipur. That's going to be for God a name. Is talking about the Megillah. It's a continuation of the verse. And it's going to be a sign forever and will never be extinguished. It's talking about the days of Purim, which we know the days of Purim are going to be even in the days of the Mashiach. Let's just see if there's any commentaries I want to say before we continue, before we close. Yeah, let's stop here. We'll go to the next verse next week. It says, he quotes over here, the Gra says, interesting like this, that is why we call Mordechai Rosh Samim, the main of the spices. He says that if a person generally has, the Gaon of Vilna says that a person generally has four senses, main senses, which is Re'iyah, to see, Shmiya, to hear, Reach, to smell, Dibur, to speak. So he says like this, three of them are connected to Torah, which is the seeing and the understanding and the speech of Torah. And Re'iyah, Shmiya, V'dibur. But the Reach, we don't find the smell of Torah, though we do find the Reach. It's because we brought in the Gemara of the Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. There's a smell of righteousness, but that comes usually from other things. It says that Reach is Tefillah, like it says Tefillah corresponds to Yishei Reach Nichayach LaHashem, and Mordechai had that quality of the fragrance of Tefillah. Though he taught Torah, but he brought the Jewish people to pray for the nullification of the decree, and brought about the nullification of the decree. All right, everyone, we're going to stop here. Reb Shua ben Levi continues, and we're now going to continue in this Agadic section that teaches us about the story of Purim itself. Laila Tov, everyone. Have a wonderful Chag of Tu B'Av.